and also making time to be with us while we discuss these important issues around transformation. So before we start this this seminar, I'd like to ask our director and editor-in-chief of the International Journal for Critical Diversity Studies, Professor Melissa Steyn, to officially welcome everybody and officially welcome the seminar. So over to you, Prof.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's rather wonderful to see this initiative coming to fruition. I think the plan to work together with the Transformation Forum and the journal is a very original idea and a very exciting development that I hope is going to bear a lot of fruit. I hope this won't be the last we see of this collaboration. I want to thank very much everybody who's agreed to participate today. We're looking forward very much to hear what people have to say. I think the topic, decolonizing praxis, is very timely. We've talked a lot about transformation over the last 30 years. The conversation has moved forward, I think, under pressure of the decolonial theory movement that has really become very important and prominent and pushes us to rethink a lot of the assumptions that we've made in the past, to take the conversation forward and indeed to take our praxis to new levels. And so I think that this conversation this afternoon is really, really important for higher education. And I want to thank everybody who's been involved in the organization for bringing this together. I'm not going to say more than that. I just think that this is a very exciting development, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof, for those insightful words and opening this wonderful seminar for us. So without further ado, because we've been talking about transformation and decolonial praxis within the university. So this seminar basically was subscribed by a lot of presenters, and from the program, the ones that were chosen to present in this particular seminar. I don't know if I should just name them or just give them their bios or as one comes up, but starting off, we've got Sayan, Dr. Sayan Day. Dr. Sayan grew up in Kolkata, West Bengal, and is currently working as a postdoc fellow at Wits Center for Diversity Studies, University of Wits. He is also the senior advisor of Quality Education Program Center for Regional Research and Sustainability Studies, India. His areas of research interests are post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, race studies, food, humanities, and critical diversity literacies. And before he presents, or his title of his presentation is The Decolonial Wrong Turn, Communal Propagandism and Regressive Intellectualities in the Higher Education System in India. So I saw Dr. Sayan is already with us. I would like to take it over to you, Dr. Sayan. And besides, and before probably you start, I would also like to alert you that each presenter has got about 15 to 20 minutes to play around. And then the Q&A session basically will follow after the presentations. If you've got any burning issues, please, probably you could write it down, or you can raise your hand and then we can attend to it. So thank you. And I hand over to Dr. Sayan.
Thank you so much, Thulani, for the humble introduction. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you so much, the Journal of Critical Diversity Studies, and the other team members who are a part of this organization aspect of this fantastic event and bringing us all together here. So as already Thulani mentioned my topic, so I'm just not repeating it, but obviously the words that are there in the topic will be getting reflected with respect to my reflections, with respect to my argument. So we will be referring to them back and forth. So what I'm planning to do in this 15 minutes span of time is to divide my reflections widely into three parts. And in that case, what I'm planning to do, the first I am planning to begin with is the perspective of decolonial wrong turn. And it actually, it very interestingly emerges from the perspective what in fact Melissa just mentioned at the very beginning. And and as she said that it is really interesting to see, it is also really very powerful to see that so many dimensions of decolonial praxis have already emerged within the institutional spaces across the world. And also what is also really nice to see is the kind of intersectional spaces that these praxis are all developing through curating different forms of projects, which are both within the academic spaces as well as outside. But also it kind of reminds me, and especially this reminder comes from the positionality from where I speak, which I also need to be very categorical and mentioning because I come from India, and the positionality from where I speak is with respect to my experiences within the Indian academic system, especially over the last over the last few years, if I must say, the kind of transformation that the Indian academic system is going, which I understand or I wish to argue as the decolonial wrong turn. And it is, not very much unknown to us that since the inception of decolonial movements, praxis, projects, resistant movements across the globe, across different points of time and space, we have seen one thing, that there have also been tendencies of, pushing this project towards a wrong direction from various perspectives, in terms of curricular perspectives, in terms of pedagogical perspectives, and which actually has been, very much argued by various critiques. If you're talking about Priyamvada Gopal, if you're talking about Eve Tuck, if you're talking about Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui from Bolivia, if you're talking about Aditya Nigam, and several other critics across the world, have actually pointed out that it is necessary for us to be critical about decoloniality. What we need is not just talking about decoloniality or decolonial praxis, but the critical decolonial praxis is a very necessary aspect, because that kind of invites us to question before we accept, before we agree, before we apply. It's necessary for us to question, the decolonial praxis that we are engaged into, whether individually or collectively. And this actually again emerges, as I said already, with respect to my experiences, because recently what have been seen is in India, with respect to the current political structure that is very much set in India right now, it is actually widely affecting, it is widely impacting the entire process of knowledge learning, the entire process of knowledge production in the country. And in the name of going back to the indigenous systems of knowledges in the country, in the name of going back to reviving the local native indigenous systems of knowledges, what is actually happening is, under the mask of decoloniality, it is in a way of reproducing the very colonial patterns of thinking and doing. So it is just a decoloniality as a buzzword, decoloniality as a metaphor. But in reality, what is actually happening is the recreation, the reproduction of the very European / modern / colonial patterns of knowledge production. And obviously, I will justify this point with a couple of examples in the process of my reflection, in the process of my presentation. But what exactly is happening in the name of decoloniality? So what we see is, a set of projects or distortions have been launched in the country. Distortions from different paradigms, distortions of different dimensions. And the first is the distortion of and the promotion of the Hindu religious ideologies. The first thing, the first problematic thing is where you see the very religious notion, the very religious perspective of Hinduism has been distorted and reduced to a set of ideologies that kind of satisfied the self-profiting motives of certain political entities, certain religious entities, certain institutional entities. And then those ideologies are being propagated across the country as a decolonial perspective, and also as a way of dismantling the existence of the several other patterns, other forms, other communal, cultural, religious, social, and political forms of knowledges that exist in the country. So the first, under this distortion project, this pan-Indian distortion project, the first thing what I point out is the distortion of this and the promotion of wrong, misinterpreted religious ideologies across the country, number one. Number two is distorting the scientific knowledge systems. I don't know if you have heard, these strange science knowledge proposals, which are absolutely baseless, which are logically also, makes no sense. For instance, I don't know how much you're familiar with the mythological figure like Ravana, who features in the ancient classical text of Ramayana. And in the classical text, it is mentioned that Ravana, flies an aircraft. So, but then, a few so-called indigenous, self-styled, self-certified indigenous scientists come to the forefront, and without any logic, without any reasoning, without any underlying, scientific knowledge system, comes to the forefront and, claims that Ravana was the one who first invented the aeroplane or the aircraft. And, then you have such kind of weird, distorted, out of place, scientific proposals which have no underlying, logical basis. And then you have, historical narratives. There are also a lot of historical narratives which have either been systematically silenced, by removing them from the syllabuses, just because they do not affiliate to the expectations and the norms of the so-called Hindutva ideology of the present governing structure, or they have been, very systematically distorted and presented in a communally biased manner. And it is also being done in a very systematic manner. You see through publishing books, through lectures, through conferences, through documentaries, through making movies, and, trying to trigger, communal biasness, communal conflicts and hatred amongst the people. And also there are other various dimensions. Obviously, in the process of our discussions and reflections, we can, talk more about it. But you see, just to give you a few examples, how this project of distortion has been launched in the country. And one amongst many reasons why I refer to these projects of going back to the indigenous cultures and traditions is actually not happening in that sense. Rather, what is happening is it is further degrading the already existing degraded state of the native indigenous cultures and traditions of the country that were once distorted and dehumanized by the European colonizers. And now it continue in the same pattern, I mean, in the same way, but obviously through different tools and aspects. And the two other points which I actually wanted to talk about is where I also mentioned in my topic is the communal propagandism and the regressive intellectualities in the higher education systems of India. Now, obviously, these kind of proposals, the question is, in spite of the people knowing about the vagueness and the fakeness of these kind of perspectives, these kind of arguments, the question is then, why do people, or how do these kind of discourses get so much officially authenticated? Because obviously, these kind of discourses only come to the forefront, to the public media, once it has passed through several layers of authentication at the diverse institutional level. And this actually questions, so how does it happen? So this question brings out that how these things, get cooked and, kind of authenticated, within the educational spaces, within the very educational spaces. And as it happened, and I'll give you two examples, one about communal propagandism and regressive intellectualities. So one dates back to 2019. So there is this university also, and which happens to be my alma mater as well. It's a Banaras Hindu University, and in 2019, the Sanskrit department in the Banaras Hindu University made a historical move by recruiting a Muslim professor who is going to teach Sanskrit. And the person who was recruited, in terms of his academic capability and intellectual capability was unquestionable. And he proved his mettle in the interview, and he was recruited there. And it was the first time in the history of the university to recruit a Muslim in a Sanskrit department, which by default is regarded as, as the monopoly of the Brahmins in the country, as a typical the monopoly of the Brahmins in the country, not even the entire Hindu community, but just the Brahmins. So this move was institutionally condemned. Protests broke out. The teachers and the students all came together to make sure that his recruitment is not taking place. Still, when he was recruited, institutionally situations were created so that he is forced to resign, and finally, and very unfortunately, after a few months of struggling to make a place there in the department, and he was all across the newspapers and everywhere, just because he is a Muslim. And that's why, through giving scriptural reasons, through giving religious logic and aspects, that a Muslim cannot teach Sanskrit. So, this was actually one incident that I wish to set as an example of communal propagandism and regressive intellectualities in the name of decoloniality. And the number two is a very recent one. It's happened in 2021. In fact, just a month back or a couple of months back. So it is again from another very premier institution, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Where they introduced a course on Islamophobia, and what are the factors that trigger Islamophobia, and what are the factors that actually lead to the cause of Islamophobia. And very openly and directly, they just associated the causes of Islamophobia as Muslims, how Muslims contribute towards creating fear about Muslims amongst the non-Muslims in the country, in India, as well as across the world. So we see that how these knowledge systems, these problematic knowledge systems in the name of decoloniality, in the name of indigeneity, gets harvested very authentically, very systematically within the educational institutions of India, and then it gets propagated across the country and across the globe. So these are some of the, obviously there are ample of examples, ample of criticisms, ample of logic to talk about on this aspect. But yes, as I can also see, my 15 minutes are almost on the verge of getting over. So I would like to stop by saying that these are some of the factors that actually invites us to think. Obviously, I speak from a particular context. I speak from the context of India. I speak from the context of being from Kolkata. But also it invites all of us from across the globe to think about parallelly, not just about celebrating the wonderful decolonial transformations that are taking place, which is necessary. We keep on celebrating and we keep on carrying forward, but also to keep a track of all these negative implications of decolonial perspectives or the misinterpretations of decolonial praxis that are also taking place across the world. Yes, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much, all of you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Sayan, for that insightful and also Indian perspective, around how things are being done in India per se. So thank you for that, Dr. Sayan. That was very interesting. So our next speaker, I would like to just jump to the next speaker so that if anyone has got a hand, probably they could write it down. If they've got a question, they could write it down, and then, or if anyone has got a question for Shayun, right now we can quickly take it and then see how Shayun responds to that question. But if there's no one, I would like to then introduce our second speaker, Precious Mutize. Mr. Precious Mutize is a Muzite, sorry, Precious, is a research associate and a PhD candidate at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. He has a master's degree in diversity studies with a special focus on critical realist disability studies and assistive technology, AT, inclusion in technical vocational colleges and the intersection of disability and sexuality. So Mr. Muzite, in his extra time, enjoys coming up with new innovations of technology, and he, alongside some colleagues, received the Wits Enterprise First Time Innovator Award on the 15th of September 2016. So without any more things to say, Precious, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Thulani, for that. So I'm just going to share quickly a slide that I want to work on as I'm presenting. So I'm just going to do that now, if you allow me, Chairman Thulani.
Yes, Precious, you can go ahead and share.
I'm just loading it now. I don't know if is it showing that side?
Yes, I can see it perfectly.
Okay, I'm just going to maximize it. All right. So my title of presentation is titled, Why is there critical interaction with disability and assistive technologies missing from academia? So I just want to also start with a background and a context to this presentation. So I'm a Zimbabwean researcher, currently based at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, doing my PhD, and I'm also working there as a research associate. So the presentation that I'm going to quickly engage on today is based on a book chapter that I extracted actually from my MA research that had to do with how assistive technologies and devices that are used by people living with disabilities actually affect the ability-disability construct. So it was also published in the books that is titled The Dynamics of Transforming Higher Tertiary Education, that was co-edited by Professor Sabelo Gachini-Ndlovu and Dr. Bustani Pofu. That was a 2020 publication. So the major arguments that I'm quickly going to touch on is that obviously, as the title proclaims, that there's actually there's a lack of a critical discourse and engagement in disability studies and assistive technologies. So this is also part of a larger argument that has been prompted by disability scholars across the world, and it was actually started by Chapman in 2009 from the University of Toronto, who actually started to engage with these critical discourses and actually saying that we've been fixated in rehabilitative and medical and social discourses in disability studies that we've actually failed to propel disability engagements to a critical discourse, and also importantly to a decolonial perspective of it. And I've actually co-opted this discussion to actually include the Global South as well. So the second argument is that the construction of disability studies actually need to incorporate things of intersectionality, gender, poverty, class, and race. So that is how we can actually bring out the critical aspect of disability studies in incorporating the theme of intersectionality, that has to bring in and put into consideration the class issues, race issues, poverty, and issues of gender and sexuality. In doing this, I've actually stated on the far right of my presentation that the different scholars that I've used, and I've used Judith Butler's work, Minolo's work, Michael Foucault's work, but most importantly, I've actually used local scholars, that is Professor Gacheni Dlovu, who's actually talked about how, you know, the issue of colonization, how it actually, you know, the process itself of the scramble of Africa and the fighting that came with it was a violent, you know, event that actually did not only lead to the, you know, to the conquest of the indigenous people, but it actually led, you know, to the violence actually led to the, you know, loss of limb and you know, and all this that actually led to, you know, deformities, disabilities, which we can actually, you know, relate up to today. And then secondly, what Gacheni, Dlovu, and others actually talk about is the process of coloniality that actually continues long after the decolonization process. So we find that, you know, due to the subjugation of indigenous people, and we can talk about the context of Southern Africa, you know, it led to actually the marginalization of people and of particular people and race, and that actually led to people working out in the mines and the factories and the, you know, and toiling in the farms, where, you know, accidents happen and it can actually lead to disability itself. And I also borrow from Jasper Paul the term debilitation, which actually talks about, you know, the physical lack of limb and legs and sight and all that, but it actually talks about impairment as the lack of opportunities and the marginalization of people, which can actually be, you know, lead actually to debilitation and disability, you know, as to say. So these are the major arguments. So they talk about like how decolonization should not be used as a metaphor only for conquest, but it can actually lead to disability and its construction. And I talked about debilitation and all that other aspects. So the methodologies that were used for the study, for my MA study, that actually led to this published article. It was an interpretive technique where semi-structured 1-hour interviews were used with people living with locomotor disabilities. So it was centered around the town of Johannesburg, and obviously it was an MA research. I had to like minimize, you know, the amount of people that I was going to interview, so I chose 10. But you know, obviously it fed into that discourse of, if you want to do disability research, you need to involve the people that are actually living the experience. So you know, the nothing about us aspect that Choudson talks about. So that was the methodology. And to actually sum it up, you know, the whole research, I had an anecdote that I picked up from one of, you know, the interviews, and it was, you know, I can just read it out. It says, "I remember my reaction when The Witcher first came out. I cried my soul out. God, why have you forsaken me? Questions and endless tears. The nursing staff helps me up and placed me up on this object. I hated it all with my heart. To me, it represented my helplessness." So you know, these were like, you know, it actually summed out the whole findings from the research to actually talk about how, you know, the assistive technologies have been socialized to actually, you know, depict helplessness and dependency that has been associated with it. And, you know, the way the users themselves, the people that are living with disabilities, actually perceive those technologies, it is actually informed by this whole, and, you know, and these bigger discourses that comes with society's perceptions of them. So there's need to be that deconstruction of how these assistive technologies have been used. And just to define what assistive technologies are, these are like any technologies that, you know, enables people that are living with disability to function in a normalized, and I say normalized in quotations, lifestyles, and you know, and from this I actually problematize this definition in the sense that it actually assumes that people living with disabilities are not living fulfilled lives, and they are lacking, and it talks to the whole discourse of eugenics and, you know, corrective procedures that are aimed to correct, you know, deformity, and actually assume that, you know, people are not living wholesome lives. So that is how I actually defined it. And so the findings are, as I said, they actually came up with 4 or 5 themes that were very important in the article and the study. It actually highlighted new trends that are centered around the use of assistive technology and devices, and one of them was in, you know, the convergence of technology. So I found that, you know, most of the people that were in the study, they actually were using more than one assistive device. So most of them were like, perhaps maybe someone with a wheelchair user was actually using technology such as computers, you know, phones, you know, social media as well, and all these come up to converge so that at least it actually, you know, increase that person's ability to function and to be incorporated in society. And also social accessibility of assistive technologies, as I said, was actually linked to how society actually talk about these assistive devices and the stigma and discrimination that comes with it. And in terms of identity formation, I also found that, you know, people with that identified as the deaf in capital D actually, you know, we're using assistive devices like cochlear implants and hearing implants, and that was centered around you know, a theme of affirmation and identity formation. And in those circumstances, it actually was a positive you know, experience for those users. And accessibility issues also came out as another theme, whereby, you know, as I said, the theme of intersectionality came up in the sense that other people in the study were actually having difficulties in accessing these assistive devices. And you found, you know, extreme measures, people tending to do extreme measures like using homemade assistive devices. And there's a gentleman in the study that actually made a homemade limb, prosthetic limb out of wood as desperate measures, because, you know, most of these prosthetic limbs are not affordable to people from low income families. And to find also, even those people, the people that are in participants that could afford them, they were talking about how they had to order from, you know, from abroad, you know, they had to order from Europe and the States, all these assistive devices, and there was a lack of patenting of assistive devices that have been patented in South Africa, which can actually decrease the, you know, the affordability, I mean, the prices of these devices. So those were the issues that were actually come up, issues of accessibilities, and how it was actually a problem using assistive devices in a Southern African context. So the conclusion was that more disability and decolonial work needs to be conducted in the global South. And as I said, if we're talking about decolonial perspective of disability, we need to talk about themes of intersectionality and cover, like, how does poverty, how does class, how does race, how does sexuality, how does gender intersect to influence the lived experience of people living with disabilities. And it needs to be more of these research that needs to be done. So Thulani, without just wasting time, I'm gonna end here, and I'm just gonna open up to questions if anyone has one. Over to you, Thulani.
Thank you so much, Precious, for that insightful take on your work. Also how disability has been used as a metaphor. That for me was also very interesting and exciting to hear. But also your critique around the AT as being almost a medical model kind of thing, where assistive technology, you know, it's almost like falls into that trap of the medical model, and a whole lot of disability scholars write a lot about the medical model and its challenges. So thank you so much, Precious, for the wonderful presentation on disability and inclusion within the TVET colleges. So our next, so thank you. So our next presenter is Dr. William Mpofu from the University of the Witwatersrand. And then his profile reads like Dr. William Jethro Mpofu is a researcher at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies at Wits. He holds a multidisciplinary doctorate in decolonial studies, philosophy, politics, and communication. Mpofu is a founding member of the African Decolonial Research Network, ADEN, and his latest book is Robert Mugabe and the Will to Power in an African Post-Colony, New York, Palgrave, 2021. Dr. Mpofu's presentation is titled Coloniality and Nativism in the Westernized University in South Africa, a philosophy of liberation perspective. Over to you, Dr. Mpofu. Hello, Dr. Mpofu. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Thulani.
Oh.
Hi, we're
Okay.
here.
Oh, you're still here.
I don't know
Okay.
where Dr. Mpofu is.
You don't know where Dr. Mpofu is. Okay, probably we can.
Can you hear me, Thulani?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Mpofu.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what the problem was there because I could hear you clearly, but it seems you couldn't hear me clearly. All right, my presentation is, as you have just introduced, concerned with coloniality and nativism in the Westernized University in South Africa. It was my ambition to frame it as coloniality and nativism in the Westernized University of the Global South. But I think it became critically convenient that I narrow it to the South African setting, which only becomes a case that we can use to look at the Global South at large, critically that is. What I'm trying to do here is to reflect on how the Westernized University in South Africa it has actually been an instrument of and a facility of conquest. That is, the Western model of the university, as we experience it and as we function in it, became instrumentalized and weaponized in the context of Western Europe's conquest of the Global South. Hence the importance of the term Westernized, which implies that there are other models of the university besides the
This is the
the Western
decolonization.
one.
Let me see who's in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see people?
There is another person speaking behind my voice. Can you hear that, Thulani?
Yes. Can you please unmute yourself
Okay.
or mute yourself? I think you can continue, Dr. Mpofu.
Whereby Europe, with its land mass of 8% of the entire planet, from 1492 to 1914, had conquered more than 84% of the world. And that conquest entailed domination, exploitation, oppression, and murder, mass murder of the conquered. And this was not done statedly as conquest and domination, but it was covered up behind mesmerizing furnitures of civilization, modernization, Christianization, development, democratization, freedom, and liberation even, which means that the conquest of the rest by the West was sugar-coated with other mesmerizing furnitures and enticements and covered up as duty to God, when actually it was violence of one against the other. I wish to elect to begin my presentation at the end, Thulani. That is, before I delve into this description of the problem of coloniality and nativism in the Westernized University in South Africa, I want to spell out from where I stand, from where I try to think in terms of liberation philosophy. What fundamentally will be what can be called a decolonized university or liberated university in the global South. I mean, there's a lot of focalization of we need to transform this, we need to decolonize this, we need to democratize this, we need to at the end, because I'm naturally going to run out of time, and I don't want the question to linger as to, yes, decolonize this, de-westernize this, but what kind of a university is that? I'll try to describe that university here before I delve into the meat of my brief presentation. A decolonized university will first and foremost be a university characterized by human diversity, where different human beings from different backgrounds, different positionalities and geographic locations can find home and do intellectual and academic work. Importantly, again, this university ought to have epistemic diversity, where knowledges of the different people of the world, different geographies and histories of the world can encounter each other in critical friction, and not a place where other people's knowledges and histories are reduced to superstition, and other people's knowledges are elevated to the knowledges and all that. Epistemic diversity will be a critical and very important plank of a decolonized university. And this decolonized university, as a third point, Thulani, will also be multilingual. Studies and experiences have actually proven that any language under the sun can be developed into a language of science, into a language of law, into a language of politics, and into a language of education. And one of the best examples of such a language that was developed from nothing to something is the Afrikaans language in South Africa. The way in which the Afrikaans language was developed from a dialect to a language of law, a language of science, a language of record, and a language of politics and sociality. That can be done with any language. So it is important that a decolonized and liberated university in the global south becomes multilingual. And students of education theory and praxis have proven that the way people are educated, mother tongue matters, mother languages matters, indigenous languages matters. So the idea of people being educated in other languages besides theirs, in colonial languages as it were, sort of disadvantages them in the process of acquiring and circulating knowledge. And this particular university is supposed to be inclusive, culturally, socially, spiritually, and infrastructurally. By infrastructural, I mean the way this place is architectured and built should be inclusive. What does that mean? What is the suggestion and gesture of my observation? When a Black student walks into a university and there is the statue of Cecil John Rhodes erected there and looking glorious, that young person as a victim of conquest will experience that statue not as a decoration, not as a commemoration, but as a reminder of being conquered, being defeated, being dispossessed, and being displaced in a particular space. So it is important that infrastructurally a university becomes inclusive in that there are no figurines, statues or symbols, or any other artifacts and constructions that seem to reinforce rather than negate the history, the experience, and the condition of conquest. After that, that kind of university needs to be critically universal and critically cosmopolitan, meaning that it must be a university in the universal sense of the word, where people from different directions meet and encounter each other and do work without others feeling alienated, violated, or feeling unneeded, or feeling that the sensibility and the feel of the place says you are not wanted here, or you are a visitor, you are being tolerated, and all that. In that way, the university that is decolonized should be socially just as a space and a location. And point number 8, this place should be a place that valorizes rigor. Rigor as in critical industry, critical application. That homework of questioning things, questioning ideas, and questioning ourselves. I emphasize rigor over and above standards and quality, because the words standard and quality have somehow become code words for epistemic racism. The idea that quality in thinking, quality in intellectual work belongs to a certain race, to a certain age, to a certain gender, and certain other people, not all others. So rigor, to me, signifies that importance of thoroughness in our work that one can express without invoking the racist codes of quality and standards that the propagandists against coloniality use to try and shout down students when they demand decolonization of higher education. It must be a site of questioning, where knowledge production and the seeking of knowledge is characterized more by asking questions rather than by the laborious work of trying to supply answers and give timeless truths and all that. It must not be based on authority and privilege, but the humility of questioning rather than the authority of answering questions and supplying answers. And this place must, as a final point, be characterized more by dissensus rather than consensus. They shouldn't be seeking of agreements, seeking of unities, and seeking of echoes, seeking of choruses, and comfortable agreements about issues, but distance us as the search of knowledge through questioning, critical disagreements, and respectful tensions and frictions that are critically productive. I think I began at the end by describing what this decolonized university would look like. Now I can drift back to the beginning of my presentation, where I made the bold allegation that the westernized university, as we experience it, is a facility of and a weapon of conquest. And conquest not as an event of the past, but conquest as an event and a condition that continues to unfold in the global south and other pockets and corners of the world where inferiorized, conquered, dispossessed, and displaced people are found. And I want to describe the Western conquest of the global south itself as one pandemic that we should still continue to look at and still continue to dissect and seek to draw understandings and meanings out of. How did this happen? How did the West end up like that small province of the world that ended up turning itself into the center, if not into the world itself, where Western men ended up becoming the man as the human being? Some people talk of gunpowder. Others talk about just technological advancement. Others talk about the capacity for evil, the willingness and the readiness to kill other people for power. Others give it to disease that ravaged other places and weakened them and made them susceptible to conquest, poverty, and hunger, and the will to power of the Europeans to conquer others by any means necessary, and some means quite unnecessary. And that enlightenment made of God, where ethics and the fear of God were expelled from politics, and certain human beings thought they could do what they can with others for power. Adam Smith wrote about it in the Wealth of Nations, and many other Western philosophers and thinkers did allude to the need for that will to power, where to survive, some people will have to be masters of others, no matter the expenses and the cost. So it began with what Enrique Dussel has described as the Western eco conquiro, where it was said, I conquer, therefore I am. So when René Descartes came with, I think, therefore I am, which was the valorization of reason as what made men men, the eco conquiro had already taken place, the will to conquest, and the belief in it being right that other people can be conquered and dominated. And as that happened with gunpowder, technology, and other powers, there was a knowledge system, there was a sensibility, there was a reason and a rationality that fueled this conquest. And I want to isolate and elect the westernized university, Western thinking, the passions of the Western mind as part of this development in the world. Yeah, and after that, I think we need to quickly narrow back to South Africa, conquest and the becoming of this university. That is the subject of my deliberation right now. Scholars have described what is called the lie of 1652, like Patrick Mellett, which produced South Africa into what it is, where some people came in, pretended that there were no other people, and displaced, dispossessed, and made all outlandish claims to justify the violence. And the question was power by any means necessary. Other historians and thinkers like Makubane have spoken about the critical part of Vasco da Gama's rounding up of the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 as what opened ways for the production of South Africa as it is. The conquest and then the production of South Africa out of this space, out of the time, and out of the populations and whatever other entities were there. So conquest took place here, and the effects, the aftermaths and the afterlives of that conquest are still with us in terms of the coloniality that Sayan Day described, and Precious also touched on it and all that. So there we are. Conquest unfolded, conquest happened, and lives, places, peoples were no longer the same again. Yeah, and then this westernized university became instrumental, became a weapon, but also at the same time a product of this conquest that we're talking about. There's an interesting researcher that is, of course, conveniently marginalized in our universities. His name is Robert Kricker. He has written a series of papers about how the universities in South Africa were born. One such paper is titled, I think it's a paper for 2016, titled Shredding the Veil of Reconciliation, where he talks about the legislations that shaped South Africa and that produced the university as we have it. There was the Native Lands Act of 1913. There was the Peace of Vereeniging Agreement in 1902, which actually solidified the superiority of the white races in South Africa, the British mainly and the Dutch, to the exclusion of other races. And then there was the consolidation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. All these were legislations that were fortifying white superiority, unity and humanity against others. But specifically in 1916, that's when the collective of legislations that produced the universities were formulated. The formulation of UCT, Stellenbosch University, University of South Africa, and Wits University in 1922. So these universities were constructed, promoted, legislated, politicized, and culturalized as what they are. And their motto was for the education of the sons of empire, which is what Robert Kricker makes important and which is important to us. These institutions were designed for the education of the sons of empire, not daughters of empire, not Black people, not Indians, not women, not Black women in particular, and not other people, but the sons of empire. That means a lot. And we can ask the question, has that stopped or it still continues? Have these universities been rehabilitated from being universities for the sons of empire and they become universities for all those that work and live or practice their lives therein? That is important to note. So de-Westernizing these universities, decolonizing them, is the actual liberation homework of undoing those colonial designs, imperial designs, the Westernization, the colonization, and the project of the sons of empire. In saying that, I think it is important to observe that in actuality, this Western model of the university that has become hegemonic, dominant, and that is put across as the standard for universitiness, was and is not the only model of the university. There are other models of universities in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. Well, in Europe, the history of the university is presented to us as the history of the European university. You are told about Bologna 1088 as the first university in the world, Oxford in 1096, I think, and a whole list of all of them. Nobody teaches about or talks about Al-Zahar in Egypt, Alexandria, Timbuktu, and other ancient African universities, Asian universities, and universities elsewhere. Just like the history of the world is supposed to be the history of Europe in the world, not the history of the world. All those constructions, distortions, and deconstructions need to be looked at when we reflect on the idea of de-Westernizing, decolonizing, and liberating the university as we work and as we know it. What happened when these universities were constructed and instituted and legislated, as I have described, is that they became really instruments and weapons at the center of the project of conquest and its aims and objectives. Just like Albert Memmi has authoritatively and canonically narrated, when secular colonialism sets in, it does not only produce seculars, it also produces natives. Once seculars and natives come into existence, the project of colonialism is fulfilled. New political identities are produced in shape of seculars and their natives, natives and their seculars. Once that happens, two political fundamentalisms are produced. The fundamentalism of coloniality itself, the conquest that it comes with and the racism that it comes with, and then the fundamentalism of nativism, where natives themselves cannot be any other thing besides being natives, just like seculars cannot be any other thing besides being seculars. Once those two fundamentalisms are produced, there is a contest in the core constitution of these political identities and projects, which are both problematic. So in the process of attempting and imagining the decolonization of the university, coloniality and nativism have come forward. I think Sayan did good homework in illustrating from the Indian context how in the process of attempting to negate coloniality, we tend to invoke another fundamentalism, another extremism in shape of nativism, which does not negate but reinforces coloniality, where you now have a Olympics of power. If you're a secular, therefore I'm a native. Being a native, then I must go back to pre-colonial Africa. I must go back to animal skins. I must go out of technology and use primordial modes of engaging just for me to exercise my being a native. That's when you get decolonization as villagization. This university must belong to us because we were born here. And then decolonization as primitivism, where we must now do anything that we can do to invoke pre-colonial Africa just to show that we're decolonizing. And then decolonization as resistance to education itself. Why should I write journal papers? Why should I write book chapters? I'm decolonizing. Why should I do the work itself in the university? Because I'm decolonizing. Why should I write a dissertation instead of a poem? Because I'm decolonizing. And such other arguments as an illustration. So what we get as an entanglement in the present westernized university in South Africa is a contest between coloniality as a fundamentalism and nativism as a fundamentalism. And these contests are themselves colonial, are themselves racist, are themselves domineering, and are themselves elitist and privileged, and do not attend to the project of liberation that will deliver the kind of university that I tried to describe. So what we have here now, you have a university as a marketplace, a university as a sexist, fundamentalist, patriarchal entity, as a racist space institutionally, systemically, and structurally. And the engagement of coloniality and nativism does not even help the situation in that we have a stalemate where those identities of secular and native, even without being named so, keep coming up, keep contesting each other and keep negating each other. And very easily, decolonization and the coloniality that is struggles with becomes that endless tussle of remove and replace, which is the same colonial logic whereby there was African knowledge here, let's replace it with Western knowledge, which was the conquest. There were African people here, let's replace them with European settlers. There were African histories here, let's replace them with the history of Europe. So if you are going to decolonize by doing the same, like there was Shakespeare here, let me put my credo mutwa. There was Plato here, let me put Che Anta Diop. It's a remove and replace logic, which is colonial logic. Whereas a liberation project would be, let's have a conversation between Plato and Che Anta Diop. And let's have a conversation between Credo Mutwa and René Descartes. That is liberating rather than removing and replacing one entity by another in the name of decolonization, which actually continues the project of conquest. Dispossess, displace, remove, replace, and all that. So briefly, this is my gesture that we need to go over and above the stalemate of coloniality and nativism in the Westernized university and seek a liberated university where critical friction, human diversity, epistemic diversity, infrastructural diversity, and epistemic justice, hermeneutic justice, and other justices find home. And then we can function outside the perimeters, outside the impositions, and outside the prescriptions of conquest. Colleagues, I hope I've made my point in this presentation, and I think I can pack it here so that the conversation can continue. Otherwise, thank you very much once again for this opportunity to participate in this important and relevant seminar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mpofu. That was such a powerful presentation that you just gave us there. From the history's perspective to, and then bringing us up to the current situation where we are. I think you did a comprehensive take on how the university has actually been compromised. But then for me, Dr. Mpofu, I had probably not a slight question, but, or is it a comment? I don't know now. In terms of, so you talk about the South African University, and I do understand how legislation has also helped enact some of these hegemonic universities, specifically UCT or your historically white universities. I also know that there's also legislation for Black universities, but then for me, my point is, or my question is, are those HBUs also considered Western universities? Because my understanding is they were created in order to probably reproduce the kind of class position that Black people would continuously have in life, you know. So your universities like your Fort Hayes, your Walter Sisulus, weren't necessarily in, or probably I'm not thinking them in the same light as your Western universities. I don't know. Yeah, that's my question or comment there. I don't know if you could get something.
I'm talking about the Westernized university in South Africa. By Westernized, I mean those are institutions and systems of higher education that have been Westernized. That have been made to follow, to rehearse, and enact the Western model of higher education in the global South, which was the colonization of knowledge, the coloniality of knowledge that scholars talk about. And no institution of education has been left out of Westernization. from kindergarten to higher education. That is why when I participate with others in imagining what a decolonized university will be, I keep insisting that it must be a university that is rooted in Africa, but globally relevant and also globally competitive, but rooted in Africa. Because the effect of the westernization of the university and the colonization of the university was to uproot the university from its African sensibility and history and hang it in the air as an outpost of a European university. I actually maybe forgot to mention that these universities that I was talking about, when they were founded, the universities that Robert Kricker has researched about, when they were founded as university colleges of Oxford, Cambridge, and other universities in the West. They were actually campuses, if you want to put it graphically, of Western universities that were located in South Africa. The examination systems, the curricula, everything, the pedagogies and other internal structures and what of the universities were actually founded, structured, and systematized in Europe, and then only effected here. So it has been a lot of work already trying to disentangle these universities from these are still university colleges of European universities, and they need to be liberated from that and made into universities that are rooted in Africa and then are globally relevant and globally competitive, but rooted in the geography, in the societies, and in the communities from where they are based, and fed by the epistemologies and the histories of the people around them, the communities that surround them that are supposed to benefit and prosper from their existence. Thank you, Thulani. I hope I've answered you there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Doc. That was very insightful and also very powerful. I know people might be itching to raise their hands or probably to add something or to comment, but I would like to probably move on to the next speaker and would say probably that if people have something to say, either you can paste it on the chat or you can write it down, and then once we open up the Q&A, you can probably raise your question. So moving on to our fourth presenter, go by the name Dr. Jess Auerbach. So Dr. Jess Auerbach, I'm not sure if I'm not butchering that, but I think I'm not, is an award senior lecturer in anthropology at Northwest University and is an Iso Lomso Fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies. She holds a Bachelor of Social Science from UCT and Masters in Science from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and a PhD from Stanford. She spent 3 years in Mauritius, where she helped to establish an experimental university and conducted research on higher education futures for the Mauritian Tertiary Education Commission. She has numerous scholarly and popular publications, and her work has been translated into Portuguese, German, French, and Italian. She is the author of the monograph From Water to Wine, Becoming Middle Class in Angola and Archive of Kindness, Stories of Everyday Heroism During the South African Lockdown. Dr. Jess's presentation today will be titled Students as Producers, Not Consumers, Enabling Voice as a Core Component of Decolonial Pedagogy in the Academy. So without any more introductions to add, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Jess Auerbach. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you all. I've really been enjoying the presentation so far. And yeah, my CV is about as colonial as they come, and I'm very aware of those dynamics. But looking forward to sharing some ideas and thoughts with you anyway. Just going to share a short presentation that I've made. I hope that it's in an appropriately accessible form. So yeah, today the talk that I'm going to give is slightly different. The paper that I'm writing for the special edition with the journal, and it's really tracing a particular project around enabling students to become knowledge producers at an earlier stage in their undergraduate training, so as soon as they start academic training, as a kind of act of decolonial pedagogy in the academy. And just so you know, the image you're looking at, on the top left is the continent of Africa inverted with Europe underneath it, and it's basically an inverted map privileging the South Atlantic and the North Atlantic space. And it's a map that I use quite a lot in thinking, because in teaching, sorry, because of its effectiveness and just helping students and sometimes helping ourselves to recognize the extent to which received models and representations of the world shape our own situatedness within systems of knowledge. And you know, in the introduction, it's kind of excruciating almost hearing the ways in which my own journeys have been shaped by these colonial structures of knowledge. But it's also been a really interesting process biographically to encounter knowledge histories in action in these very different spaces in the world. So in addition to the kind of UK and US stuff, I've spent a lot of time teaching in Angola and Brazil, and both of those have been really important spaces of insight and learning about knowledge systems within the Lusophone canon, and obviously have informed a lot of the work that I'm sharing with you today. So I'm going to kind of talk about this piece, which came out in May 2017. And what happened is, after I was, when I was completing my PhD, I really wanted to come home. I'm from South Africa, and I like living in the US. It was interesting, but it was definitely not somewhere that I wanted to settle, and was very keen to come back to South Africa immediately. But for various reasons, I was offered a position setting up a new social science faculty and program at the African Leadership College, which at the time was this kind of emerging university in Mauritius, set up by the educational entrepreneur Fred Swanepoel, who's a Ghanaian. And the idea of this program and this institution was supposed to be to bring students together from around the continent of Africa and give them a kind of education that would allow them to become leaders. Now, there's a lot that one can say and should say about sort of neoliberal discourse of leadership, and there's a lot of theoretical work that I and various colleagues have done and continue to do around unpacking some of that, because it turns out that this institution was really the absolute embodiment of what happens when neoliberalism meets higher education. And we all ended up resigning the whole social science program on the same day, around about the time that our students were referred to as, quote, failed prototypes, end quote. And there was a lot of intensity to the two-year project that we were involved in, and that, of course, our students were part of and have remained part of, and many of them from that time have gone on to do quite remarkable and interesting things. But it was a project that also didn't work in certain ways, in that the whole social science faculty resigned. There were non-disclosure agreements. There was all sorts of really intense legal stuff that happened because the institution decided that it wanted to focus on a more traditional version of entrepreneurship. And that was really in the kind of domain of consulting, rather than something that was more critical and that really aimed to change epistemic and ontological systems and structures. So it was a really interesting process to be part of. Now, when we were setting it up, it was 2017. And so it was shortly after, or still in the midst of some of the Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall student movements across in South Africa, but that were already shifting around the world. It was the time of Black Lives Matter. It was the time of Me Too. There was a lot going on globally. And of course, the students in our classes were really part of that. It was a small group of students, about 27 in the first year, about 18 the year after that, and then after that point, I stopped taking on incoming students, but we spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how do we get this right? You know, all things being equal, given the opportunity to reinvent a university, how do you actually do it? And it was a really amazing space to come into as a sort of newly minted PhD. And I did a lot of this work with a colleague from Eswatini and another colleague from Kenya, Lunga Dlamini and Janice Ndegwa, and another colleague from Argentina, Mata Patayo. And the four of us, Lunga's brief was really looking at African studies, and Janice, Mata, and I were on social sciences as a kind of broad construct. And so we spent a lot of time thinking, we spent a lot of time talking, you know, what are the kinds of interventions that we need to do? And one of them was, we made these 7 commitments to decolonial social science. And I won't go into each of them because today I just want to focus on the notion of students as producers, not only consumers of knowledge, and explore the extent to which we might consider this part of the decolonial shift in higher education. But then I really like what was said earlier about the decolonial wrong turn, because there are so many ways in which this discourse has been appropriated and is kind of used in a sense to maintain the status quo. Now, in the end, with this project, we were told very explicitly by university management that the word decoloniality should not be associated with the African Leadership University brand. And so we were to kind of ensure that all of this stuff was silenced as quickly as possible. But this article in the conversation that I have on the slide was read more than 400,000 times worldwide, and really kind of seemed to resonate with a lot of what people were thinking at the time. I share this piece as well, because when we think about inverting images of the world and considering the ways in which knowledge systems are internalized and can potentially not be internalized, maps and map making is very important. And this figure comes out of a piece written by myself and 2 professional ecologists, and recently published in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution, which is one of Nature's big journals. And it's been very interesting to see how it's been received, because this is a map that represents the naming of bird species after Europeans. And basically it shows how, in terms of the naming of species in the Latin structures and also the popular names, you can see the ontological impact of European domination, where the further away from Europe itself you get, the more names you have after Europeans. And it's particularly interesting looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo, the kind of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, now the space where there is the sort of greatest stamping of European names into the flora and fauna of the system. But what's been interesting also with this is that this map has been picked up by right-wing Twitter in really fascinating ways, where we probably on a daily basis have numerous individuals taking the trouble to invert it for us and to inform us as authors that this is an incorrect version of the world. And it's really seemed to have like hit into something emotional, where the world must be seen according to this representation of the global north. And it's interesting for me because the idea of the map comes from my grade 6 geography teacher when I was in primary school. And this was early 1990s South Africa, really interesting moment to start school. And our geography teacher pointed out very simply that the ways in which European navigation happened in the 1500s, the Europeans wanted to put themselves closest to God, and so they put themselves on top because they understood heaven to be on top. And I think this speaks into a lot of what Prof. Mpofu was saying a few moments ago, that these kind of hierarchies of knowledge are sort of layered onto the imagination. But all it took was a primary school teacher to just kind of flip a globe in a classroom, and that really changed the way that I grew up looking at the world, and consequently some of the work that has been done with teaching and with colleagues. And so, you know, I'm just returning to this image again because I think it's then helpful to start reflecting on what kind of connectivities are prioritized, what kinds of perspectives on the world are given to students in particular. And with the African Leadership College, we were really focusing on how do you ensure that a group of students from across the African continent, who are 18 and 19 when they start, so they don't necessarily know all that much yet. And it's a really interesting challenge in a digital age where students have access to so much information, but haven't necessarily yet had the opportunity to learn the skills of processing information and going deep. And I'm looking more and more at digital capabilities, which is the ability of students not only to use the internet, but to use it well, and to understand the power dynamics that are kind of conscripted onto digital spaces. And I'll get to that in a moment. And I was really thinking and writing against what I call monographical vision. You just see this is some guy from Shutterstock with a monograph, a monocle. But this kind of very fundamental European view of the world that requires a kind of singular scientific lens, as opposed to something that is more stereoscopic, that is more multiply cited, that is able to capture what we might consider multiple truths, multiple perspectives. There's all kinds of interesting theoretical stuff that I explore a bit in the paper, but I'm not going to get into here with that. But really saying that we need to shift the way that we teach and the way that we work with students in terms of their knowledge processes to something that leaves this guy and his monocle behind and gets into a different form of knowledge and seeing the world. And so I've played a lot with this idea of spectrographic teaching and learning, where the voices of students come out into the classroom as a sort of fundamental piece of knowledge production. So for example, instead of getting students to write an essay, I think it's very important that students know how to write, and I certainly don't doubt that. And they need to learn to write well. I'm not so convinced they need to learn citation anymore, but I think they need to learn how to reference ideas appropriately. Because of course, if you teach them paper pile on Google Documents, a lot of these functions are becoming automated. So there's an extent of like needing to understand the history of the knowledge and the history of the convention around citation, for example, but then spending a lot more time on histories of knowledge. And so, I use the spectrogram here just to highlight this is a visual representation of voice. But if we want our students to be speaking into the world by the time they graduate, and we want our students to shift the discourse around Africa, for example, I'm not sure that we have the time to wait until they all have PhDs, especially because at the moment, students are working and living within a really interesting digital domain. And you see this, the image on the left here is of a weaponized robot dog. This was released last week by Sword International. These kind of cute robots that are now, of course, carrying military weapons. And I mean, we understand the global military industrial complex. This should come as no surprise to anyone. And the other image there of that little monster is an Instagram page that my husband happens to run, where this teddy bear turned into an influencer, and it's a kind of it's mostly a big joke. But the point that I'm making with it is that students are existing as content producers in a very sophisticated and complex digital space. And instead of teaching them to write essays per se, there's a lot of opportunity in asking them to make YouTube videos and asking them to edit Wikipedia, for example, where they encounter the politics of knowledge production in a very, very real way. So I say, if you want to cite Wikipedia in your academic writing, no problem, but you need to have written the Wikipedia piece yourself. Because when you get into the politics of who edits Wikipedia and how, you also get right into the heart of how digital storytelling works. And of course, most of Wikipedia is written by white men in the global north. And not only men, but certainly the global north dominates to a huge extent. To the point that while I was doing my research on Angola, there was a really funny moment where Facebook was trialing this free basics thing where they were trying to get Africa, quote unquote, online. And a group of Angolans were editing Wikipedia pages and using them to embed major files, because Wikipedia was a free data, zero-rated resource. And so what people were doing was they were sharing movies via Wikipedia. And it was a very clever solution to a data scarce environment. But it was interesting watching it be reported in the Silicon Valley press as hacking. And of course, there's nothing about hacking that can be said of editing Wikipedia, except that in this case, the people doing the editing were people who are not imagined to be computer literate. And it speaks again into this kind of global imagination of who becomes part of dialogue shaping versus dialogue receiving. And I feel that very strongly that in order to equip students to do well in the world, firstly, we need to really address the issue of an internalized sense of consciousness of who they are. And, that speaks straight into Biko, into Seymour, into Césaire. And wherever possible, we get our students to read in the original languages of a lot of this kind of decolonial theory and work, and really have tried to prioritize multilingualism. So every week we've assigned one text that isn't in English, and the students have to grapple through it, using digital technologies as translation if they can, finding a friend who speaks whatever language the text is in, and really speaking through what is known and what is not known. And that's important for recognizing the limits of knowledge in English. And then, of course, thinking through digital platforms as well. And it's been something that I think in doing that and in helping students to recognize who they're speaking to, how they're speaking, and what tools they're using to speak, we're then able to equip them to start shifting the dialogue and shifting the narrative and shifting the visual representation and the kind of basic knowledge base of global imagination in a much more powerful way. So these are some of the texts that I really use in my thinking. The book Digital Democracy, Analog Politics is written by Nanjala Nyabola, and she and I were ironically in the same class at Oxford. And it was in 2009, 2010, where there was this moment where the infrastructure of the internet as we know it today that has kind of gone really intense, especially over COVID, was just being put in place. And what were the presuppositions of the internet at that time? Who were the imagined participants of the World Wide Web and the contributions that people, particularly in places like the continent of Africa, were and weren't making? And Nanjala's point in this book is that Twitter, she looks particularly at Twitter in Kenya, and the ways in which democracy is reconfigured in African social networks over and over again. But this is largely ignored by the people who make a lot of the tools. And I think Nanjala has done phenomenal work in trying to shift some of the ways in which African connectivity and disconnectivity is imagined. And this book by Clapton Mavunga as well is an interesting kind of thinking piece about science, technology, and innovation from Africa. But I think it really, we need to add in the piece of where is pedagogy here? What is the role of the universities? And so some of the earlier work that Dr. Mpofu was speaking about needs to be connected and really linked into these questions of science and technology at this moment. And then, of course, the book by Shoshana Zuboff, which is a really important and interesting one, and I'd recommend you read all three. This book speaks about the ways in which the traces of our lives, the traces of our digital activity are captured and used in order to promulgate certain kinds of global capital, which of course are linked into the very, very same systems that have held us and shaped us over the last 500 years and more. And I think, again, speaking into the points that were raised by the first speaker, Dr. Day, that this is not new. These are the same systems dressed in new clothing, and in the same way that there's a risk of decolonial washing, there's also a risk of technological liberation washing. And I mean, Stanford, where I did my PhD, was the worst culprit of all of this, where you just add design thinking and all global systems are magically undone, and we can sing Kumbaya around a multiracial fire. And of course, it's so much more complex than that. What I reflect on in this particular paper is this project called The Archive of Kindness, Stories of Everyday Heroism during the South African lockdown. So I had this experience of getting students to be knowledge producers. It had worked really well at the African Leadership College, even though the broader project didn't succeed. And again, the students went on to thrive, so I sleep easy at night on that. But the lessons that it taught me were really significant in terms of what it means to get students involved in shaping the dialogue right from the beginning. And I was hired by Northwest in the middle of the pandemic, the university that I'm teaching at now. It took me almost a year before I could even visit the campus. And this was a course that I took on entirely online, having never been to any of the three campuses where the university has a presence. And what it was a graphic design course that looking at power and narrative. And we got students in the course to collect stories about the ways in which people in South Africa were helping one another with sort of responses to the new contingencies of the pandemic. And they recorded between them about 2,000 acts of extraordinary kindness and heroism from around the country. And the reason that this became a book was because of the course evaluations. And it's an unusual trajectory. But the students wrote in the course evaluations that this completely changed their experience of the country. They completely changed their sense of mental health during the pandemic, that in being compelled, in a sense, to look for good, they were able to find a version of South Africa that is far beyond the received narrative of kind of corruption, complexity, racial tension. Because at the level of the micro, often what we live is very, very different. And people were able to find examples that were nourishing, that were affirming, and that helped with mental health. Which raises this kind of question of, again, what is the role of the university? How do we allow our students to understand the complexity of the systems around us, but also help them to develop good mental health practices, a sense of hope? You know, is there any point having a student graduate into the world who doesn't have hope, whether that be on climate change, whether that be on social and political stability, on political ideology? What is our role as academics, not only to provide critique, but to provide potential pathways for solution? And so I'm wrapping up, and I think there are these really interesting ideas around futures of universities that come out of this. The first is to really pick up on Dr. Day's suggestion there about the decolonial wrong turn. You know, it does feel like now everybody's doing decoloniality. I was reading a journal of business ethics that's in the Fortune 500 articles, journals that must be used for business, and they're publishing about decoloniality, and Nature is publishing about decoloniality. But what is actually changing in terms of university systems and structures? It seems not very much at all. There was a little moment in 2015 and 16 that it shifted, but especially with COVID, we've now kind of gone into some sort of survival mode. And in terms of actually addressing the inherent power structures, these issues of whose voices are included and excluded, we haven't really seemed to make all that much progress. And I really liked what Prof. Mpofu was talking about language. You know, how do we address these issues that the digital tools that we're now using are almost entirely in English and potentially emerging in a way in Chinese? So where are we looking at in terms of the ability to create not only our own content, but also, of course, control and manage the tools? And I also like this thing about this kind of tension between what is imagined as rigor and the kind of ethical standard of listening and being and working that really requires putting voices that have historically been excluded from the academy, including undergraduates, into a position where they can really be heard and engaged. And I've written some pieces, a piece on Africa as a country about just the performative game of academia as it stands today, where increasingly many of us are writing for the recognition of algorithms. And it's basically, what is my Google citation score? What is my H-index score? I want to be promoted to whatever it is, but for that to happen, I need to make sure that the algorithms recognize my work through my ORCID ID and through my kind of public internet profile, which is entirely controlled by a Google algorithm and perhaps at best DuckDuckGo. And so I think we need to recognize the extent to which we are all, or many of us, really engaging in this kind of bizarre neoliberal and surveillance capitalist kind of game, where a lot of what we're even doing is extracted and used to predict our future activities, including at a political and social level. And then here I say, just kind of in conclusion, you know, what are we willing to sacrifice, and who must make that sacrifice? And what will higher education look like in 15 years' time? Because of course, I think the reason that we've got this bizarre decolonial turn right now is that in everybody jumping on a bandwagon and saying, cool, we must be decolonial and we must assign a few more non-white writers in our classrooms, everybody else gets to keep their jobs, and things remain as they have been. Sorry, there's something at the bus going on outside. I hope it's not too noisy. But people are able to kind of maintain the academic privilege of what is ultimately quite a cushy job with a lot of flexibility and very convenient working hours, and, you know, and some nice status and stuff. But at the same time, that group of permanent employees at the university who are protected in all sorts of really interesting ways by the structures of academic knowledge informed by the US notion of tenure, are therefore responsive or not responsive to shifts in knowledge that need to happen maybe more quickly than they are at the moment. But to do so might need some kind of sacrifice from within the university system itself. And one of the questions then becomes, who makes that sacrifice? Because so far it's largely been the students. It's been the students losing out on the kind of intellectual and ontological nourishment that is often needed. It's the students losing out on the resources that they need. And it's also future generations not getting the education that is going to equip them to make sense of a world that is rapidly changing. And so I think looking into this question of where does higher education go in the next 15 years? What happens at this moment of surveillance capitalism, meeting neoliberalism, meeting something like the decolonial turn? And how do we prepare ourselves and prepare the university system for that? I think there's just a lot of really rich and interesting questions to think with. And I mean, in the paper for the chapter, I've written about what it means to prioritize kindness. You can call it kindness, you can call it Ubuntu, you can call it citizenship, but this kind of focus on the good, and I'm developing this notion of knowledge curatorialism as a way into that, of saying how do we curate and make sense of knowledge systems as a kind of responsibility for our students, instead of just teaching content as we might have expected of universities 20 years ago. But so I'm kind of ending with many more questions and answers, and thank you. I've really enjoyed listening to all of you. Also, just to say, I have to leave at 3:30 to teach, so I may miss some of the Q&A, but thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Doc. That was so brilliant. And colleagues, this is a perfect example of what decolonizing praxis really looks like, you know, as the theme of the seminar. So yeah, you know, getting the students' voices, and also Dr. Jess, I must say that whole inverting the map is so profound for me, you know. I never really looked at it from that angle, you know, and also what you said, you know, they put themselves in the top so that they're closer to God. Wow. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Jess, and for that insightful presentation on how you get your students to become the owners of their own knowledge production. As you might have heard Dr. Jess saying she's gonna leave at 3:30. Does anyone have something, suggestion, comment, question, anything to add to Dr. Jess before they leave? Or any reflection? Okay, silence means everything is on order, is in order. Okay, so then I'll have to move on to the next presenter, and that will be Dr. Margaret Blackie from Stellenbosch University, presenting a title called Diversity is an Asset to Science and Not a Threat. So Margaret is a senior lecturer in the Department of Chemistry and Polymer Science at Stellenbosch. She has research interests in medicinal chemistry and tertiary science education. She is currently a leader in the field of decolonization of STEM education. Yeah, so that's Dr. Margaret Blackie. So thank you so much. I will hand over to Dr. Margaret. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see the slides. So I just want to, I'm also, much like Professor Mpofu did earlier, I'm going to essentially start my talk at the end to show you where I'm building towards. And I think it's very important to say from the outset that what I'm going to present here today may look very obvious to those of you who are from the social sciences. But my project, as I am embedded deeply in STEM, I teach chemistry. And so my goal from the start of, really from the start of the whole Fees Must Fall protests, and in particular, responding to the Science Must Fall video, My personal project, beginning in collaboration with Dr. Hanley Ardendorf, has been to take the question really has been, how do we engage with the question of decolonization in a STEM environment in particular? And I think, again, many of the issues pointed to by Professor Mpofu earlier will be that how do we retain the powerful knowledge that is there, and yet lay open to critique the ways in which our educational system is, sorry, I just want to start my timer so I don't go over. The ways in which our system is profoundly infused by coloniality. And so I've been working in various ways on this for a number of years now, and most recently drawing on critical realism to provide actually what I think is now a relatively strong argument that can be taken into science. So again, forgive me, my main contribution is, and my main audience is to my colleagues in science. So those of you who are well embedded in social sciences may wonder why it's so important to deliberate on particular issues. So just bear that in mind as I speak. So ultimately, the conclusion that I'm working towards in this presentation is that diversity of persons exploring scientific problems is good for science itself. And again, from Professor Mpofu and from Dr. Jess's presentations, one element of this that I really haven't considered deeply at all is the issue of language, which obviously brings its own metaphorical world, which I think is a very interesting thing to consider. So I thank you both for bringing that to my attention. Anyway, so as I say, the conclusion that I'm working towards is this idea that diversity of persons exploring scientific problems is good for science. And why is this necessarily important? This is important because science, out of its sense of we are offering objective knowledge, will jettison any argument that is based simply on a social good. Because its argument will be, and I suggest that this is a misunderstanding of the notion of objectivity, its argument would be that we are trying to occupy something of a neutral space, and therefore any ideological underpinning is going to be problematic. So my goal in developing this argument is developing an argument that has strong social justice implications, but is not requiring change for the sake of social justice. So I think the origins of this, as I've said previously, my own interest in this comes from an intersection of two issues. One, the issue of decolonization in STEM education, and this argument that science is objective, and I'll explain in a minute why I believe that the understanding there of objectivity is incorrect. And a second interest is where is the human person in chemistry education? If education is supposed to be a transformative experience, as many people argue that it is, who are we trying to transform and to what? And I think that question lies at the heart of the whole question around coloniality as well. So if we lose sight of the human person, which frankly has happened to a large degree in science education, then we tend to conflate science as objective. Science holds objective knowledge, shall we say, with the notion that scientists are objective. And I think that I probably don't need to waste much time at all within this particular audience this afternoon making the case for the fact that scientists are not objective. But I can tell you, having raised that as a potential issue within an audience of scientists, that is somehow profoundly threatening. So critical realism, I'm not going to go into much of the details of critical realism, but simply to say this is the way that Bhaskar understands the nature of the world, and the nature of the world such that we can interrogate it scientifically. It has these three tiers. There is the real, which encompasses everything, which really are potential mechanisms which account for the things in the world that we see. So if there is a ball rolling down a plane, then the real mechanism at play there is the force of gravity. The actual, using that example again, the actual is the event that is happening. So the ball rolling down the plane would be the event, and the empirical is the space in which that event could be observed. So the ball could be rolling down the plane, and nobody might be around to see it. In which case, it would satisfy the real. It would be using the real to create an actual event, but there would be no empirical observation thereof. So the point here is that in Bhaskar's understanding, what we are doing as scientists is not passive observation of the real. Rather, our role as scientists is limiting what we are observing empirically, such that only one real mechanism or a small handful of real mechanisms are in play. Thus, the scientist is an agent, not a passive observer in the process. The implication then is that the scientist is not and cannot be the locus of objectivity. The locus of objectivity, again, that word objectivity I'm struggling with, but it's so strongly held in science, I continue to use it. The locus of the reliable, reproducible knowledge that we find in science is the real mechanism, because it is real. It exists in the real world. It exists before humanity existed. It will exist after humanity has long gone. And again, here I'm talking about natural science, not social science, although these things can overlap. So as a particular example, I've already given one example, but as a particular example from my own context, which is synthetic organic chemistry, there's several ways that one can improve a particular reaction. You could change the solvent, you could change the base that you use, you could change the catalyst that you used. And what's important here is that, again, the real mechanism which creates the reaction will continue to exist. Tinkering with the solvent or the base or the catalyst will change the outcome, will change the empirical outcome. And the change thereof will be dictated to by the training of the scientist in play. So I might decide that the most obvious place to begin my optimization of that reaction will be by changing the solvent, and the person on the bench next to me might decide that changing the base makes most sense. All that will dictate that choice will be really the prior experience of the person. One isn't inherently better or worse than the other. So the objectivity then lies in the reality and unchanging nature of the mechanism we are exploring or utilizing, not in the being of the scientist. And here, the crucial thing is that we fail to distinguish between the development of an experiment and the reproducibility of that experiment. So if we look at what happens with the development of a scientific concept, in a particular experiment, we have intentional closure of a system. And essentially how the scientific process goes is we rinse and repeat until it's reliably reproducible, and then we report on it. We publish the data. Presuming, of course, that we have a voice we are recognized as a legitimate person in the scientific realm, we can then publish the data. then what happens is that, sorry, wrong way, is that other researchers will pay attention to that and start doing experiments. And if those experiments all are consistent, then the suggestion will be that the mechanism seems to hold. Now, up until maybe 20 years ago, most of the people conducting those experiments were white cisgendered heterosexual males from the global north. In the last little while, there has been a distinct shift. We still have a long way to go, but we have had a distinct shift in that space. And so we are now getting a greater diversity of person beginning to do the experiment. So I've said this several times, but again, the reproducibility is not is a product of the real mechanism, not an inherent quality of the scientist. And what makes something qualify as an accepted scientific concept requires both the reliability of the mechanism and acceptance by the community. And of course, acceptance by the community comes with an expectation that things should be published in English. And again, if you're not a white heterosexual male, you have to, cisgendered male, you have to sort of overcome whatever your particular, you have to prove that your femaleness or your blackness or your transgenderedness doesn't get in the way of your rational behavior. However, what I want to say here is that if we, instead of having people who are all identical, performing experiments to interrogate the same mechanism, what happens if we have a diversity of person? Now, intellectually, that plays out if there are two people trying to interrogate the same mechanism and they've both gone through identical training, they're going to interrogate it in the same way. Whereas if I have somebody who's trained in chemistry and mathematics or somebody who's trained in chemistry and biology, they're going to ask different questions of the problem. Now, I extend that, and I extend that in my previous work already in terms of understanding that different mental models, different life experience, and as I say, I thank you for the inspiration about language. The use of different languages will afford the use of different mental models. And the greater diversity of person, the greater diversity of life experience, the greater diversity of training, provided there is a sufficient grounding in the field of chemistry, will give rise to a more robust and frankly quicker coalescing of an idea on a particular scientific concept. So if we have, for example, two hypothetical chemists, one builds model trains and one bakes. In the lab, there are two ways that experiments can go wrong. You can measure things badly, or you can put your glassware together badly. The person who builds model trains is most likely to interrogate the glassware first. The one who bakes is most likely to figure out, is going to check their measurements first. So it's just the deep recognition that actually diversity is necessary. It's not just a nice to have, but it is necessary for the progress in science. And I realize I'm just coming to the end, so I'll skip over that slide. I think that the crucial thing here is that particularity of observation is not an issue if knowledge is understood as a collective process, not an individual event. And this classic example of, how do we recognize an elephant? Well, it depends what we're looking at. Objective knowledge arises from collective, collaborative, authentic subjectivity. And therefore, the greater diversity of person that we have involved in that knowledge project, the better off we will be. When we think objectivity comes from the attempted erasure of my personal foibles, we will choose those who most closely resemble ourselves in training, and in person to perpetuate the field. When we recognize objective knowledge is situated in the joint effort of the community, it becomes immediately obvious that diversity is, I've said, valuable here, but is in fact necessary. So thank you very much. As I say, this may seem extremely obvious to those of you from a social science background, but from us who reside in science, it's really not that obvious at all. And my purpose is to develop an argument that I can take back to my colleagues in a STEM environment and convince them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Blackie. That was also a very interesting presentation, especially because diversity in the STEM. So for instance, people working in humanities or social sciences, we talk and you rightly mentioned this, that it might sound so obvious to us, you know, but it's also interesting that from the STEM perspective, there's no much work or no much effort being put into diversity. And it's only now that there's this new kind of push towards increasing numbers in STEM. And so your kind of presentation is quite also brilliantly placed in the sense that it shows the benefits of having diversity basically within the STEM field. And for me, that is basically also what I would term fitting perfectly, succinctly into the theme of decolonizing praxis. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Blackie. According to the program, we had one more last speaker, Dr. Gera, who unfortunately could not join us from what I'm hearing, and therefore it makes our presentation a little bit shorter in terms of the time we had budgeted for this session. So with that being said, I don't know if this would be the right time to open up for any comments, open up the Q&A session. Any comments, any suggestions, any reflections, anything that comes up to mind, as we move this conversation towards the close. So I'll like to take this opportunity to open up the floor to anybody. If you feel like probably you are not comfortable speaking, you can type on the chat. Yeah, I think that's about it. So the floor is yours. You can raise your hand. Yeah.
Melissa has a hand raised.
Oh, okay. I can see the screens. So Prof. Melissa, you can go through.
Okay. No, I actually just wanted to say, is it Professor Blackie or Dr. Blackie? I'm not sure, forgive me. But I just wanted to say that this message, you sort of added the caveat many times that that this was something that you felt needed to be raised in the STEM subjects, but that somehow you feel that other fields may be beyond it, which may be true for a few very limited fields, but I think overwhelmingly in terms of our knowledge production, the importance of what you talked about here is not appreciated. The fact that objectivity actually comes through having diversity of scholars. I think that actually is still a message that has not been internalized across the university at all in many fields. And in some ways, I think definitely to the detriment of the knowledge that is being produced. And one can think of fields where it's actually quite dangerous, violent and dangerous. So I think that it's really important. And I think your explanation was so beautiful using the critical realist framework, which I think really should reach through to many audiences.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Anyone else with a burning reflection, suggestion, comment? I saw Zetu had typed something earlier on. I don't know if Zetu, you'd wanna, speak to that comment.
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. And my question is actually directed to Dr. Mpofu. You know, in an intellectual space, whenever we are having arguments, those arguments are based on theoretical frameworks, and most disciplines have adopted Eurocentric theories. My question is, which theories will inform teaching and learning in a decolonized university? And secondly, to what extent have universities of the South embraced the philosophy of our African writers like Steve Biko and other African writers like Ngugi?
Okay, thank you. Can I answer now, Thulani, or at the end?
Yes, Doc, you can continue.
Yeah, what the struggle is and what it is about in the present is actually to get legitimacy and credibility for thoughts, for theories, as much as the histories and the persons of the global South. It's still quite an event in a university of the global South to demand the use of indigenous theories as theories in the university. And that is the name of the struggle, that as Ngugi himself said, that we need to move the center. That is the center of Europe is the center of thought, Europe is the center of humanity, and Europe is the center of theory. There is need to start giving legitimacy, credibility, and workability to theories, histories, and persons and places of the South in the decolonized academy. And that is work that is still being done, which has not yet been achieved. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Dr. Mpofu, for that. Zetu, are you satisfied with that response?
I am satisfied, but maybe we need to be very aggressive about the strategy that we need to embark on. My sense is that if there is a resistance at the present moment, in as far as this project of decolonization is concerned, how challenging is it gonna be going into the future? And I think that unless we make a concerted effort as to how are we going to ensure that there is legitimacy around these African theories and philosophies.
No, thank you. Thank you for that, Mpofu. I see Claire has got her hand up as well. Claire, you can come through.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, it's an extension of Zetu's comment, I think. I've always been so interested in how, because these knowledge systems are tied to the flow of resources, so even within my small experience of transformation at Stellenbosch University, we always hit up against this problem of resourcing, and certainly within the academic, within the academic world, your capacity to do research, to live, to teach, is tied to resourcing. And, you know, these resource networks are international, they're global, and they are tied to particular kind of sets of knowledges. And I'm just interested in how we crack that nut of resourcing. I see it, for example, in the argument around multilingualism. It's something we grapple with a lot at Stellenbosch, as you might know. Yeah, so I'm interested in that nut, about how we crack that nut around resourcing, given that much of the resourcing lies in the hands of those who espouse those kind of Western colonial knowledge systems. Yeah, I don't know if Dr. Mpofu would like to just reflect on that.
Thank you, Claire.
Yes, Claire, thank you so much. Yeah, the trouble is that money and other resources, especially money at the forefront, are frequently usable to suffocate research projects or to enable others, preferred ones, and give them currency and all that. And it takes us back to the political economy of knowledge production. That, just like I said in my presentation, that power uses either gunpowder or money and other of its instruments to disable other currents and then to enable other currents. But there is need in the global South for a change of, for a real turn in the way powers that be look at research. Like people talk frequently these days about the COVID-19 research and the vaccines that have been produced, and that none has ever come from any African country. The Asians have tried, some Latin Americans have tried, but for African governments to take research seriously as to invest funds in it, it looks to be difficult. It's not that Africa has no scientists or Africa has no scholars or researchers that could produce a vaccine, but there was no political and financial will in African governments to do anything like that. So there is need for another turn attitudinally to start looking at knowledge and knowledge production differently. And then after that, investing in knowledge and knowledge production will become feasible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mpofu.
Thank you.
And Claire for that question. Any takers, seeing that we are now down to 12 participants, I think it could be very nice if we could hear from other people who haven't shared anything, you know, how the seminar was, almost like a reflective session, you know, while we get ready for the final closing of this seminar. So does anyone who hasn't said anything want to add and reflect on the session and how it went for them? Any comments? Yes, Claire, come again.
I just want to speak from the position of, you know, one of the members of the Transformation Managers Forum, and, you know, one of the co-hosts of the series. And I suppose I just wanted to say that, you know, I thought it was an incredibly rich session. I think such a lot of texture and so many layers in the conversation we've had. And I think a really kind of fitting end to a series that has been unusual, I think, in its focus and the way that it's brought practice and theory together, and that I think has been really useful and interesting to those of us who do the work well, in a particular way in the context of higher education. So I just wanted to extend my thanks and just my appreciation for all of the presentations, and to say that I thought it was enormously rich and textured, and thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We would also like to thank you for also giving us the opportunity of hosting this seminar in collaboration with the Transformation Managers Forum. Without anything to say, I would like to hand over this to Rudo Muzite, who's the editorial researcher for the journal, to probably add some few words before we close this session.
Thank you, Thulani. Thank you, Thulani. I would just like to say from the IJCDS team and from the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, thank you to everyone. Thank you to the presenters, today's presenters. Thank you to everyone who has been in attendance. Also, thank you to Claire for putting together this special issue for us. Just a bit of information on our journal. We publish biannually and we are peer reviewed. We do accept research and theoretical articles and also commentaries and book reviews. I have pasted in the chat the link to our submission platform. And also you can, for any inquiries, you can email us at ijcds.wickets@wits.ac.za. I have also pasted that in the chat. But overall, from the IJCDS team and from Wickets, I would like to thank everyone for this seminar today, and see you all soon in the different areas that we meet. For those that we don't, thank you so much for today. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Rudo. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rudo.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you, Rudo. Bye, everybody.
Bye.